Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. A pie carried across a field on a Tuesday morning. A wooden porch. A man who had forgotten how to expect good things. A woman who had been bringing good things for 3 years without being asked and without keeping score. Margaret Hale was 25 years old and had lived on the neighboring property her entire life. She knew the Calloway Ranch the way she knew her own hands, the creak of the gate, the particular lean of the old barn, the way the morning light hit the Rocky Mountains to the west and turned everything briefly gold. She knew Thomas Calloway, too. 55 years old, widower, the kind of man that a hard life makes either bitter or quiet. Thomas had chosen quiet. He worked his land, kept his word, and had spent 3 years learning to live in a house that was too large for one person. She had been bringing him food since Eleanor died, not out of pity, out of the particular care you give someone you have watched carry something heavy for a long time. On a Tuesday morning in September, she brought him an apple pie. He looked at it, then at her. Then he smiled, the rare smile, the one that changed his whole face. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. He meant it as a joke. She looked at him with an expression he didn't know how to read. Because for Margaret Hale, it wasn't a joke at all. Eleanor Calloway had died in the spring of 1880. Not suddenly. The illness had taken its time, the way illnesses do when they want to be thorough. Thomas had sat with her through all of it. That was what people said about Thomas Calloway afterward, that he went back to work the next morning. Some said it admiringly, some said it with concern. Thomas himself had no opinion about it. He simply didn't know what else to do. Margaret had known Eleanor well. The two families had been neighbors for 30 years, her parents on the south property, the Calloways on the north, and Eleanor had been the kind of woman who made a neighborhood feel like a community. When Eleanor died, something went quiet that had always been warm. Margaret started bringing food 2 weeks after the funeral. Not every day. She was running her own property, which was 40 acres and required her full attention since her parents had moved to Denver to be near her sister. Just Tuesdays. A pot of something, or bread or pie when the apples were good. Thomas always accepted it with the same words. "You didn't have to." Margaret always gave the same answer. "I know." They had this exchange so many times it had become its own kind of conversation, a shorthand for something neither of them examined too closely. What Thomas noticed, over 3 years of Tuesdays, was that Margaret Hale was extraordinarily capable. She ran the south property alone without complaint, and without asking for help she didn't need. She fixed her own fences. She negotiated her own cattle prices at the market in Durango and got better rates than men twice her experience because she had done her research and knew exactly what things were worth. She was also, he had noticed and immediately stopped noticing, very easy to be around. The conversation on the porch was always good. She had opinions and offered them without apology. She laughed at things he said without examining the categorization too closely, under the heading of good neighbor. It was a solid category. It required nothing of him. He intended to keep her there indefinitely. Right up until the Tuesday morning she arrived with the apple pie, and he said the thing he said, and she looked at him the way she looked at him, and the category began, quietly and without his permission, to fall apart. The town of Durango had opinions about Margaret Hale. This was not surprising. Durango was a growing town in 1883. The railroad had arrived 2 years prior, bringing commerce and newcomers and the particular energy of a place that believes it is becoming something. And growing towns have opinions about everything, especially about young women who run properties alone and don't seem to need saving. The opinion that concerned Margaret most was the one about Daniel Marsh. Daniel was 28 years old, the son of the most prosperous merchant in Durango, handsome in the arranged way of men who have always known they were handsome. And he had been making his interest in Margaret known since the previous spring. Not aggressively, he was too smooth for that. He brought things by. He appeared at the market on the days she was there. He said the right things in the right tone. The town approved of him enthusiastically. He was young. He was prosperous. He would, people agreed, make an excellent husband for Margaret Hale, who was lovely and capable, but was going to wear herself out running that property alone if she wasn't careful. Martha Greer at the dry goods store told Margaret directly, "That Daniel Marsh is a good man. You could do considerably worse." Margaret thanked her and bought her flour and said nothing else. "He's asked about you 3 times this month. 3 times, Margaret. At what point do you give the man a chance?" "When I want to," Margaret said pleasantly. "And when will that be?" Margaret looked at the mountains to the west, those Colorado mountains, always there, always reliable, always exactly themselves. "I don't know," she said, which was not entirely true. She had a fairly clear sense of when she wanted to give Daniel Marsh a chance, and the answer was approximately never. And the reason for that answer was something she was not yet ready to say out loud, because saying it out loud would make it real, and real things had consequences. She had made the pie on a Monday evening, good apples from the tree at the south end of her property, the ones that came in sweet in September. She made the crust the way her mother had taught her, cold butter, cold hands, don't overwork it. She crimped the edges carefully. She would later admit to herself, being more careful than the occasion strictly required. She carried it across the field on Tuesday morning under a sky that was doing what Colorado skies do in September, an improbable blue, the kind that makes everything below it look like a painting. Thomas was on the porch when she arrived. He usually was on Tuesday mornings, as if he had learned the rhythm of her visits without acknowledging that he had. He was drinking coffee and looking at the mountains with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with mornings. She came up the porch steps and held out the pie. He looked at it with genuine appreciation. Thomas Calloway was a man who understood the value of a well-made pie, which Margaret had always considered a point in his favor. "Apple," he said. Rare smile, the one that arrived slowly and changed his whole face. The one that made him look like a younger version of himself, and he said, "If only I were 10 years younger." He said it lightly, the way you say things that are meant to land gently and move on. Margaret looked at him. The Colorado morning held them both. A hawk turned overhead. The mountains did what they always did. 10 years wouldn't be enough, she said. And then, before he could parse that, she set the pie on the porch railing and said she had cattle to check and went back across the field. Thomas stood on his porch and looked at the pie, and then at her retreating figure, and then at the pie again. He stood there for quite a long time. Then he went inside and poured himself more coffee and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what she had said. He thought about it for the rest of the day. He thought about it, if he was honest, for considerably longer than that. Daniel Marsh arrived at Margaret's property on a Wednesday with flowers. Not wildflowers, arranged flowers, the kind that come from a shop, which meant he had ordered them from Denver, which meant he had planned this. Margaret received them with the warmth she gave everything, and the specific internal reaction of a woman who knows exactly what flowers from Denver mean, and is not sure how to address it without being unkind. She put them in water. She offered coffee. Daniel sat at her kitchen table with the ease of a man who is accustomed to being welcome, and told her about his father's new supply contract with the railroad, which was substantial, and which he described with the modest pride of someone who wants you to know something without appearing to want you to know it. He was, she acknowledged, private. The town was right about that much. He asked if he could take her to the harvest social at the end of October. "I'll think about it," she said, which was kind enough and honest enough, and bought her time she wasn't sure what to do with. After he left, she stood at the kitchen window and looked across the field toward the Calloway ranch. The late afternoon light was on the mountains. The barn was casting a long shadow across the golden grass. Somewhere out there, Thomas was doing whatever Thomas did in the late afternoon, which she knew, because she had been paying attention for 3 years, was usually checking the north fence line. She looked at the mountains and thought about 10 years wouldn't be enough, and what she had meant by it, and whether she was being foolish, and whether being foolish mattered, and concluded, after a long time at the window, that it mattered considerably less than she had previously believed. Before we go on, I want to know what country you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments. From the United States to Australia, from Canada to Ireland, it means everything to know where this voice is reaching. Now let's get back, because Thomas Calloway is about to figure something out. Thomas Calloway was not a man who processed things quickly. He was thorough. He was careful. He turned things over the way you turn soil, completely, looking at what was underneath before deciding what to do with it. He turned over 10 years wouldn't be enough for approximately 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, he fixed the north fence, moved the cattle to the winter pasture, repaired the barn roof on the east side, and had 3 conversations with his horse Gerald, an elderly and philosophically sincere. On the 14th day, Thomas rode into Durango for supplies and heard, at the feed store, that Daniel Marsh had asked Margaret Hale to the harvest social, and that Margaret had said she'd think about it, which everyone agreed was practically a yes. Thomas bought his supplies. He rode home. He put the horse away. He sat on the porch where he had said the thing he had said and looked at, where she had set the pie on the railing and thought about a woman who had crossed this field every Tuesday for 3 years and never once asked for anything back. He thought about Eleanor. Not with guilt. Eleanor had been gone 3 years and had been, while she was here, a woman of profound good sense, who had told him more than once that stubbornness in the wrong direction was just stupidity with better posture. He thought about what Eleanor would have said about this specific situation. He was fairly certain he knew. He went inside and looked at himself in the small mirror by the kitchen door, the gray hair, the lines, the 55 years of Colorado weather on his face. And he had the specific conversation with his reflection that a man has when he is trying to talk himself into something his better judgment has already decided. His better judgment won. He put on his hat and walked across the field. She was mending the south fence when he appeared. Not on her property, at the fence line between them, which was, technically, neutral territory. He stopped at the fence and put his hands on the top rail and looked at her with the expression he wore when he had decided something and was committing to it. She kept working. She had learned, over 3 years, that Thomas Calloway said things in his own time, and that waiting was more efficient than prompting. "Margaret," he said. "Thomas," she said, without looking up. "I've at him." 10 years wouldn't be enough, he said. "I've been thinking about what that meant." "And what did you conclude?" He was quiet for a moment. The Colorado afternoon held them, the mountains, the golden grass, the particular quality of September light that makes everything look simultaneously real and like a memory. "I concluded," he said carefully, "that I don't know what you meant, and that I'd like to." He looked at the fence rail. "I'm 55 years old. I'm aware of what that means and what it doesn't mean. I'm not going to pretend it's nothing." He looked up at her. "But I'd like to know, if you're willing to tell me." She looked at this man, This careful, quiet, thoroughly decent man who had spent 3 years accepting her Tuesdays without ever asking why she kept coming. It meant, she said, that 10 years wouldn't make you any more what I was looking for. Because you're already exactly what I was looking for. The fence line between them was very quiet. A hawk crossed the Colorado sky above them. Thomas Calloway looked at Margaret Hale and felt something arrive in his chest that he had not expected to feel again. Not the echo of something old, but something entirely new, arriving without permission and without apology. The harvest social was on the last Saturday of October. Margaret went. Thomas did not. He hadn't been to a social since Eleanor, and he wasn't ready for that, and Margaret understood this without it needing to be explained. Daniel Marsh was there. He was charming and attentive and danced well, which Margaret acknowledged was a genuine quality. Martha Greer who said it. Martha was a good woman, but had the particular directness of someone who considers social diplomacy an inefficiency. "I hear you've been spending time at the Calloway Ranch," she said to Margaret, in a tone that was not quite a question. "Thomas is my neighbor," Margaret said. "He has been for my entire life. He's also 55 years old." "I'm aware." "Margaret," Martha set down her cup. "Daniel Marsh is standing 20 feet away, and he is 28 years old, and his father owns half the supply contracts in the county. I say this as someone who wishes you well." Margaret looked at Daniel across the room. He was indeed 28, and prosperous, and entirely suitable. He smiled at her when he caught her looking. She smiled back. Then she turned to Martha. "Do you know what Thomas Calloway did when my fence came down in the spring flood?" she said. "He was there the next morning, with lumber he couldn't really spare. He didn't mention it afterward, not once." She paused. "That's not a small thing, Martha. That's the whole thing." She left the social early. She rode home through the Colorado night with the mountains dark against the stars and thought about the whole thing, and what it meant to know what the whole thing was when you saw it. Daniel Marsh was everything the town wanted for her. Thomas Calloway was what she wanted for herself. She had learned, from watching her mother choose carefully and her sister choose quickly, that those two things were rarely the same. November came, and with it the particular clarity of Colorado in late autumn. The aspens had gone gold and then gone bare, the first in any way he announced or drew attention to. Margaret noticed it the way she noticed everything about the Calloway Ranch, incrementally over visits, the way you notice a garden growing. The porch railing he had been meaning to fix for 2 years was fixed. The east-facing window in the kitchen had a new frame. The spare room, the one that had held Eleanor's things, which had remained closed for 3 years, was open, aired out, the accumulated weight of it gently cleared. She noticed all of this and said nothing. On a Thursday, not a Tuesday, which she noticed, he knocked on her door. "I've been doing some work on the house," he said when she opened it. "I know," she said. "You noticed." "Thomas, I've been visiting that house for 3 years. I notice everything." He looked at his hat, which he was turning in his hands. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly." She waited. "Daniel Marsh is a good man," he said. "I know that. The town knows that. He's 28 years old, and he has good prospects, and there is every reasonable argument in his favor." He looked up at her. "I am 55 years old. I have a ranch that needs work, and a porch that I just fixed, and a kitchen window I replaced last week. I cannot compete with reasonable arguments." "Then don't," she said. He looked at her. "I'd like to come calling on you," he said, "properly, if you'll allow it." She looked at this man on her doorstep, with his hat in his hands, and his 55 years, and his fixed porch railing, and his opened spare room, and said, "Thomas Calloway, I have been waiting for you to get here for approximately— Come in, there's coffee." Durango had opinions about the development. Of course it did. Martha Greer thought it was unexpected and said so. Ruth thought it was romantic and said so louder. Daniel Marsh was gracious about it, which elevated Margaret's opinion of him somewhat, and moved on to a banker's daughter from Denver within the month, which elevated it further. Reverend Cole thought the age difference was notable and mentioned it to Thomas directly, which required some courage, and which Thomas respected even as he disagreed. "She's 25, the Reverend said. You're 55. In 20 years, Thomas said, I'll be 75. And in 20 years, she'll have had 20 years of someone who sees her clearly and means what he says." He paused. "I think that's worth something." The Reverend thought about this and nodded once, and performed the ceremony 4 months later without further comment. The courtship itself was conducted with the unhurried quality of two people who have known each other for years and are simply acknowledging what was already true. There were no grand gestures. There were suppers and conversations, and Sunday afternoons riding through the Colorado landscape, through the aspen groves and the mountain meadows, and along the creek that ran between their properties. Margaret moved into the Calloway Ranch in March of 1884, on a day when the last snow was melting off the peaks and the first green was showing in the lower meadows. She brought her books and her mother's pie recipe and a particular competence that transformed the accounts within the first month. Thomas watched her settle into the house the way water settles into its level, naturally, without announcement, complete. Sat beside him. "Are you happy?" she asked, not anxiously, just honestly. He looked at the mountains for a moment. "I stopped expecting to be," he said. "That's not the same as not being." He looked at her. "I'm happy," he said, simply, plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. She took his hand. The Colorado evening held them both. They were married on a Saturday in February 1884 in the Durango church, with the particular attendance of a community that had opinions about something and wanted to see how it resolved. Margaret wore a deep green dress the color of the Colorado pines, because she was not a woman who felt required to follow conventions that didn't suit her. Thomas wore his good jacket and stood at the altar and looked at her coming toward him, and understood, with the full weight of 55 years, that some things arrive when you have stopped looking for them, and are not less real for having arrived late. The ranch became theirs in the complete sense, not his with her in it, but genuinely shared. She kept the accounts, which were considerably better within the first quarter. He kept the cattle and the fences, and the particular knowledge of the land that comes from decades of paying attention. They divided the work not by convention, but by competence, which meant occasionally Thomas cooked, and occasionally Margaret repaired fence posts, and neither of them found this remarkable. Their son arrived in January of 1885, a boy they named William for Thomas's father. He came into the world with his mother's red hair and his father's quiet, deliberate way of looking at things, which made him, from the very beginning, a person worth watching. "Tom," he had said. Not dramatically, just honestly. "You fixed a fence for me the morning after a flood," she said, without being asked, without mentioning it afterward. She looked at him. "That's what a father does. You already know how." He didn't bring it up again. On a September morning in 1886, 3 years after the pie and the joke and the morning on the porch, Thomas was at the north fence when he saw Margaret coming across the field. Not with a pie this time, with William on her hip, red-haired and serious-faced and looking at the mountains with the expression of a child who is filing things away. She came to the fence. He opened the gate. She handed him the boy, who looked at him with Eleanor's eyes. No, with Margaret's eyes, with the Hale eyes, sharp and direct and entirely unafraid. Thomas held his son and looked at his wife, and looked at the Colorado mountains doing what they always did, and thought about a Tuesday morning 3 years ago, and a pie, and a joke that wasn't a joke, and a woman who had looked at him with an expression he didn't know how to read. He knew how to read it now. "If only I were 10 years younger," he said. Not as a joke this time, not as deflection, but as the acknowledgement of a man who understands what he almost missed. Margaret looked at him with the expression that had started everything. 10 years wouldn't have been enough, she said. I needed exactly you. Exactly this. William looked between them with the serene incomprehension of a 1-year-old who will not understand this story for many years, but will grow up inside the warmth of it. Thomas handed the boy all the arithmetic of age, that he had made the pie worth saying something foolish about. Thomas Calloway almost talked himself out of the best thing that ever happened to him. Not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, out of arithmetic. He counted his years and found them too many. He measured the distance between 55 and 25 and concluded that the distance disqualified him. He was being responsible. He was being realistic. He was being, as Margaret would have said with that dry patience of hers, wrong. Age is a real thing. It has real consequences and real weight, and anyone who says otherwise isn't paying attention. Thomas knew that. Margaret knew that. They never pretended otherwise. But Thomas had made the mistake of confusing the arithmetic of years with the arithmetic of value. He had counted the number and concluded he was too much of one thing and not enough of another. Margaret counted differently. She counted the man who showed up with lumber the morning after the flood. The man who said what he meant and meant what he said. The man who smiled rarely and meant it every time. That is not a man who has too many years. That is a man who has spent 55 years becoming exactly who he is. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who can see that most clearly is the one who has been watching from across the field. Don't let the arithmetic stop you from asking the question. Don't let the number on the calendar convince you that what you have to offer isn't enough. It might be exactly enough. It might be precisely what someone has been waiting. Story, thank you. Truly. You gave me something precious, your time and your attention, and I don't take either lightly. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone they think might need a quiet hour. That's what keeps this going. Wherever you are today, whether it's morning or evening, whether the sun is up or the stars are out, I hope this story gave you something warm to carry. May God bless every single one of you who listened today. Every one of you. Until next time, keep writing.